Battlestar Galactica wasn't the first sci-fi show to break a big Star Trek rule. When Battlestar Galactica premiered its gritty 2004 reimagining under Ronald D. Moore, it was hailed as the anti-Star Trek. The reboot ditched Starfleet optimism for moral ambiguity, turned sleek starships into rusting relics, and swapped technobabble for theological warfare. Critics and fans alike praised it as the show that dared to challenge Star Trek's utopian vision of humanity's future. But here's the twist. Battlestar Galactica wasn't the first science fiction show to break Star Trek's biggest rule. It merely perfected what others had already started, the art of rejecting Gene Roddenberry's belief in human perfection. For decades, Star Trek operated under a strict creative commandment: the future must be fundamentally good. In Roddenberry's 23rd and 24th centuries, humanity had evolved beyond greed, prejudice, and war. Conflicts came from outside, alien races, anomalies, godlike entities, but never from the flawed nature of humans themselves. It was an inspiring idea, but one that often trapped Star Trek writers within a narrative cage. What happens when drama requires imperfection? What happens when the ideal world doesn't feel true? Long before Battlestar Galactica dared to show humanity at its worst, other shows, and even Star Trek's own spin-offs, had already begun to quietly question that idealism. Babylon 5, Farscape, Stargate SG-1, and even Deep Space Nine all broke Roddenberry's sacred rule years before Commander Adama ever barked, "So say we all," the rule that defined and limited Star Trek. To understand what Battlestar Galactica rebelled against, you first have to understand Star Trek's law of optimism. Roddenberry's rule was simple but absolute. Humans of the future don't fight each other. They don't hold grudges, act selfishly, or struggle with personal demons the way people do now. In the Federation, humanity has transcended its flaws. This philosophy made Star Trek unique when it debuted in 1966. At the height of the Cold War, Roddenberry's future offered a kind of moral utopia, a world where a Russian helmsman, a Japanese pilot, and a black female communications officer could serve side by side on the same starship. It was a revolutionary dream, but it was also a creative straitjacket. Writers often struggled to create compelling stories when characters couldn't fundamentally change or make morally great choices. By Star Trek: The Next Generation, that rule had calcified. Captain Picard could be stern or diplomatic, but never wrong. The crew could face impossible dilemmas, but they'd always emerge with moral clarity. The show's humanity was aspirational, not authentic. Ronald D. Moore knew that better than anyone. He spent a decade writing for Star Trek, The Next Generation, and Deep Space Nine, constantly pushing against Roddenberry's no human conflict edict. When he finally got the chance to reboot Battlestar Galactica, he didn't just ignore that rule, he demolished it. Before the fall of the colonies, there was Deep Space Nine. Here's the truth: Star Trek itself was the first to start rebelling. Star Trek: Deep Space Nine 1993 to 1999 was where Moore and other writers began bending Roddenberry's universe toward realism. Set on a stationary space station rather than a starship of explorers, DS9 introduced politics, religion, and war in ways the Next Generation never dared. Under showrunner Ira Steven Behr, Deep Space Nine explored moral compromise, corruption, and even terrorism. Captain Sisko wasn't just a leader. He was a man who committed morally indefensible acts for the greater good, like poisoning a planet to capture an enemy or lying to drag the Romulans into war. It was a darker, more human kind of storytelling that Battlestar Galactica would later amplify. Moore himself has called DS9 the testing ground for Battlestar Galactica's tone. The Dominion War arc introduced shades of gray rarely seen in Star Trek before. For the first time, the Federation wasn't a flawless utopia. It was a fragile ideal under stress. If Star Trek was the dream, Deep Space Nine was the hangover after you woke up from it. Then came Babylon 5, humanity at war with itself. While Deep Space Nine was quietly rebelling within the Star Trek universe, J. Michael Straczynski's Babylon 5 1994 to 1998 tore up the rulebook completely. Airing at the same time, Babylon 5 told a serialized story about political decay, interstellar war, and the personal costs of leadership. It featured flawed heroes, corrupt institutions, and a very human struggle for power, everything Roddenberry's vision forbade. Unlike Star Trek, Babylon 5 didn't assume humanity had outgrown its worst impulses. Its Earth Alliance government became authoritarian, leaders were assassinated, and propaganda ruled the airwaves. It was science fiction as political allegory, far closer to Battlestar Galactica than to Star Trek. When Moore later described Battlestar as The West Wing meets Black Hawk Down in space, he was echoing the serialized realism that Babylon 5 had already pioneered. It's no coincidence that both shows drew from the same well of cynicism, the post-Cold War disillusionment of the 1990s. Where Star Trek saw humanity's destiny as cooperative, Babylon 5 and Battlestar Galactica saw it as cyclical. People might build better tools, but they'd still repeat their mistakes. Farscape took Star Trek's optimism and threw it out an airlock. If Deep Space Nine questioned Star Trek's idealism and Babylon 5 dismantled it, Farscape 1999 to 2003 laughed in its face. Its protagonist, John Crichton, wasn't a noble Starfleet officer. He was a confused astronaut who got thrown into a chaotic alien universe and had to learn to survive among criminals, fugitives, and living ships. Where Star Trek emphasized diplomacy and reason, Farscape thrived on emotion and chaos. Crichton made bad choices, lost his mind, and fought dirty. The show celebrated human imperfection in a way Star Trek never could, showing that being flawed didn't make humanity weak, it made them interesting. When Battlestar Galactica arrived a year later, it adopted that same sense of raw, unpredictable humanity. Starbuck, Apollo, and Rosalind weren't idealized explorers. They were desperate survivors making impossible choices in a collapsing world. Their strength came not from moral purity, but from perseverance in the face of moral failure. Stargate SG-1, the quiet challenger. Even Stargate SG-1, often seen as a lighter and more adventurous show, quietly undermined Star Trek's perfect humanity. Colonel Jack O'Neill and his team weren't evolved diplomats. They were military officers, prone to sarcasm, mistakes, and moral conflict. The Stargate program was secretive, bureaucratic, and often ethically murky. Humanity in SG-1 wasn't united. It was fractured by politics, ambition, and fear. It's easy to forget, but Stargate SG-1 debuted in 1997, 7 years before Battlestar Galactica. Its depiction of flawed heroes navigating imperfect systems made it one of the earliest mainstream sci-fi series to normalize human messiness, the very thing Star Trek had forbidden. Battlestar Galactica, the revolution perfected. When Battlestar Galactica finally hit screens in 2004, it didn't just reject Star Trek's optimism, it weaponized that rejection. Under Moore's leadership, the show asked what happens when faith, politics, and survival collide in the aftermath of near extinction. There were no clear heroes, no moral safety nets, and no federation to uphold the light. Adama wrestled with duty versus compassion. Rosalind blurred the line between democracy and dictatorship. Starbuck's self-destructive brilliance reflected a human heart full of chaos. Even the Cylons, the supposed villains, questioned what it meant to be human. The show's tagline, "So say we all," became an ironic hymn to collective desperation rather than unity. Humanity wasn't evolving past its flaws. It was barely holding them together. And audiences loved it. Battlestar Galactica became a cultural,